We're down to point number 2 for our section tonight and looking at the lesson we began last week entitled Rejoice in the Lord. We looked sort of at the negative side of things and how the wicked have things they rejoice in, but none of them bring eternal comfort or eternal consolation for that of their sins, or not consolation, but forgiveness of that of their sins. And so they have no hope in that of God. And so we enumerated those last week, and we're down to point number 2 that says some reasons the righteous have for rejoicing. Now this is not an exhaustive list as we know, but there's some things here we need to for sure to give some thought to as far as blessings are concerned. Some blessings, according to our estimation, are greater than others. Let me expand on that a little bit. The effect of them maybe is greater on us than maybe another blessing or some other type of blessing. We may be guilty sometimes of getting up in the morning and not being as thankful as we ought to for the night's rest and for the day the Lord has given us. It's not that we are not thankful, but we may not just pause and be thankful in our hearts and in our minds until something else happens to us. For example, if we have trouble getting out of the bed, or if we have to have assistance from someone getting us out of bed and getting our day going, most likely those people are more thankful, because it involves more. Now that doesn't mean that the blessing isn't the same. It just means to some it seems greater than others. And so keep that in mind as we look at these the list of these things here, because I think some of them we'll all find as great blessings. However, some of them maybe we just have turned, it's not that we have turned away from it, but maybe we have gotten to the point that we are not thankful as we ought to be. The first of those is temporal blessings. And from the book of Joel, he talks about how the Lord sends the rain, and the rain, how it comes down and it fertilizes and it causes the growth of the wheat and the grapes and the so on in Joel 2 in verses 23 and verse 24. But he begins in verse 23 saying, Be glad then, O children of Zion, and rejoice in the Lord your God. Now, we may take rain for granted. We may take snow for granted. We may not be thankful for snow and rain because what is associated with it is sometimes tornadoes and high winds and slick roads and so on, these things that are associated with it. But yet, we can see that in all, and I'm talking about everything as a whole, God provides for us temporal blessings. Now, there's man is all time, or scientists are all the time, looking for an explanation of why this happens, why that happens. I don't know. I'm not schooled enough to tell you what El Nino and all that stuff is, but they're allowing that now to predict the weather and predict the winter and so on. And those things may be accurate to a certain degree. And they've predicted, how much snow we'll get this winter and how cold it's going to be this winter. But they really don't know. We'll know when it comes March of next year, if we're all living. We'll know how much snow we got, because the Lord sends and he blesses us temporally. And so will there be say this was a good year for beans and potatoes in the garden. Will there be another year of beans and potatoes in the garden? Well, it's a temporal blessing from God. He sends the rain and he sends the sunshine. And so temporal blessings are sometimes things that I don't know if we take them for granted or we don't stop and think about them maybe in depth as we ought to. Now, as well, there are some things that we see, such as we set a big table of food. Okay, that comes from the rain, that comes from the sun, that comes from the farmers and those who harvest it and everything, and then those who prepare it. And then we give thanks for what God has given us. Now think of what a blessing it is for all of these things to come in order, or all of these things to fall in place, maybe I should say. And then they're all a blessing from God. And so that's what I mean, or I think what he means when he's talking about a temporal blessing. It's not that it's cold all the time or hot all the time, or I think probably the most common thing about it being too cold or it being too hot is people like to complain about it. When it's too cold, well, I wish it'd warm up. When it warms up, well, I wish it'd cool off. But it's all a blessing from God. So temporal blessing should not be overlooked. And just like he says here, God sends the rain. He puts the life in the seed. He causes the wheat to grow. And then the threshing floor is full of wheat. And then there is a bumper crop. It is because of the temporal blessings of God. Now, let's turn to the spiritual side for just a moment. He tells the disciples, Jesus does, in Luke 10, when he had sent them out on limited commission, and they come back and was telling him of the power that they exhibited through him. And he says, now, don't be, and allow me to just paraphrase a little bit, don't be so caught up in those things. That's going to, if you follow me, I'm going to provide for you. If you follow me, what I say will be done. But then he goes on to say, but rejoice because your names are written in heaven. Now, that is a wonderful, wonderful blessing. Now, I don't want us to get too literal with this. I have known people through the years, or meeting places of churches, that they kept a church roll. And if you was a member in good standing, your name was on that roll. If somebody got that or thought that you wasn't as faithful, they'd mark your name off the roll. That's not for man to judge in the sense of whose names are written in heaven. Now there might be, and this may be, the disciples there may have understood that the Jews had a roll. They kept lineage. It was all destroyed when Titus came into Jerusalem in AD 70. None of that exists now. They can't trace their lineage back anymore. But there was a roll. There may have been a roll among the Pharisees and the Sadducees and so on that they kept in order for there to be a public recognition of them as a number. Now, when we read this passage and it says our names are written in heaven, I don't want us to get so literal that we sit and ponder, I wonder if my name has been marked out. I wonder if my name is in that book. We can know, just as sure as we can serve God acceptably, that our names is written in the book of life. If we do not serve Him acceptably, shouldn't we also understand that our names are not written in the book? And so, in looking at this particular passage, he says, rejoice, be happy. Not that these things, and he's not saying that what had happened to them when they went out and what they accomplished through his name were not important. They were. But he's saying, rejoice because your names are written in heaven. Something far greater. He's saying, let's look beyond this. Let's look beyond what we have done here and realize that there is a blessing in having our names written in that of heaven. The third point is salvation. When we look to salvation, we find that joy is associated with salvation. We know that there's joy in the presence of the angels when one turns to God, and so on, as we have witnessed. But I want you to notice also from Psalms 21 in verse 1, and let me pause here and make a point from all these verses in Psalms. Take the time to study those and see if those verses in Psalms are still provable by the law of Christ today. Many of them are prophecy. Many of them is foretelling of the church that was to come. And so there's nothing wrong with using Psalms as a proof text if we don't use them in a way that takes away from what was said then under a physical law and what is said now under a spiritual law. Now, in Psalms 21 in verse 1, speaking of the joy of salvation, he says, "The king shall have joy in your strength, O Lord, and in your salvation, how greatly shall he rejoice." Some say the greatest of blessings is our salvation. And it very well may be. Very undeserving. We cannot earn it. It's given to us by our obedience unto that of God. So it's a blessing. It's a blessing. Out of all, think of it this way. Out of all the religions that are in the world, out of all the religious books that are in the world, that we as an individual can understand the plan of salvation and have the joy in Christ and the hope of heaven, our names written in the book of life, that we can have that today. Now, I'm going to tell you something. That's a blessing. That should cause us to rejoice. Because you and I, nearly 2,000 years removed from the establishment of that of the church, we need to be very thankful that God's Word has stood the test of time. He said it would. And it will continue. That God's people can withstand against whatever Satan brings against them. And I know we're small in number, but there are a lot of good, faithful Christians in this world. And every one turn to the God of heaven for their salvation. It's not that it's just, well, a person is a good moral person. They're a good spiritual person. Peter wrote in 1 Peter 1 and verse 6, "In this you greatly rejoice." Well, greatly rejoice in what, Peter? That we're kept by the power of God through faith for salvation, ready to be revealed at the last time. It's a lifetime thing. It'll keep us as long as we keep it. And so it is a blessing. Salvation is a blessing. It's not that we should be so carried away that we think we're better than everybody else because we're a Christian. No, we're just a servant. Just a servant of God. And if we can practice that humility and understand how Christ humbled himself and how he was exalted, we as well will be exalted in due time. Not in this life, but in the life which is to come. Number 4, there is a blessing in the deliverance from bondage, or the deliverance from that of sin. This apparently, Psalms 105, apparently seems to be the context of them coming out of Israel and being delivered from that bondage. But notice what it says in 105 verse 43. He brought his people out. He brought out his people, with joy, his chosen ones with gladness. He brought them out with joy. What's he talking about? He provided for them deliverance. He provided for them a way. You remember, and we're going to study this on Sunday. He spoke to Moses and he says, "I want you to go lead my people out. They're under heavy burden. I want you to go bring them out." And so here he says they come out with great rejoicing. What was the rejoicing for? Well, it was because of their deliverance. They were held by a Pharaoh that was just beyond reasoning, if you will. Delmer, you have a comment?
Yeah, I believe that when the end comes, you talk about rejoicing.
Right.
We, the church, it'll be before God, and you know what? We're rejoicing and glad.
Mm-hmm.
You remember when David sinned with Bathsheba, he said, take not this joy that he once had. He did have that joy.
Mm-hmm.
But when he sinned with Bathsheba, he thinks he lost it. And I believe he did.
Mm-hmm.
But God put him back.
Mm-hmm. He delivered him. Right. Right. Good point. Good point. Anything else? In the book of Jeremiah, we have virtually the same picture or the same setting as we see from Psalms 105. And he says, when you come out or when you're delivered, when he gathers you together, he says, remember the one who led you. Remember the ones who brought you out. When you come out, let Zion be singing. Let them be praising. Let them be streaming, as the New King James Version says, to the goodness of the Lord. Let them be streaming to that. Let them have that. You're going to receive temporal blessings of the oil and the fat and the flocks and the herds. But look with me down at the closing of verse 13. Then shall, there in the closing of verse 13, for I will turn their mourning to joy. I will turn their mourning to joy, will comfort them, and make them rejoice rather than sorrow. Now, I'm not here to evaluate anyone or to place judgment on one. But when a person realizes that they have been delivered from bondage, it's it's the most happiest time that you can have in your life. Because you understand what you've been delivered from. Now, for example, the children of Israel. They were working them hard. Their burden was great. They were working for a king who didn't appreciate them, a people who didn't appreciate them. And so their burden was great as they was in this captivity in that of Egypt. But he says here in this particular passage, when you come out, when you're being let out, come out with joy. Now what would be the comparison to that today? Come out of your bondage with joy. That's when a person decides to become a Christian and they lay off and put away all the sins without any regrets, not holding on to anything. Notice in this passage, he says that you come out and you come out singing. So he points out to them that, and points out to us, I think, as well, that when we come out of sin, that it's a clean cut, it's a clean, whatever turnabout face, however you want to look at it. And he says then, when you look back, sometimes there's some things I don't want to look back on. It embarrasses me when I was a Christian, when I was not a Christian. He says, I'll turn your mourning into joy. The heavy things you're bearing, I'll change them, turn them into joy, and will bring comfort to you. Here's my point. There's no joy in sin, to make the parallel, and there's no comfort in sin. I'm talking about everlasting comfort. And so the spiritual side of things is not just the fact that we are thankful the sun come up and the moon comes up and so on. There's much more. It's much more of a detailed set of thinking or a mindset of the Christian that we look at our salvation. You know, every one of us can look back. Maybe you don't remember the date, but you can remember when you became a Christian. You can remember what led up to you becoming a Christian. I can remember so well everything that happened while I was talking to two preachers before I became a Christian. I remember all about it. I remember making the decision and so on. And so the bondage or the burden of sin that I had been carrying around for a long time was taken away when I obeyed Christ. Now, with that in mind, the next step is, anybody have a comment? The next step is, God provides divine protection. Divine protection. Let those rejoice who put their trust in you. Let them shout for joy, and you'll defend them. Now, what are we talking about here? What are we looking at in this particular Psalm, chapter 5, verses 11 and in 12? What are we looking at here? We're looking at God as protecting us. Now, it doesn't mean that once we're a Christian, from then on, God's going to protect us and, sort of build a hedge here, and He's going to move us back over if we go too far to the right, and He's going to build a hedge here if we go too far to the left. That's not the image that I want you to see. Divine protection comes from trusting in the Lord, and then He'll defend you. Now, it's a two-step process. We trust in Him, and then He will defend us. He will be our shield in verse 12. He will bless the righteous. Have you ever thought that, we pay house insurance, car insurance, and anything we have to have insurance on it, and health insurance, and so on and so forth. But we have a divine insurance policy with God. He'll protect us. Now, we have to understand that from Scripture. Does that mean that we'll never be persecuted? No. No, that's not what that means. But He will protect us. Whatever we're faced with, He's with us, and it will be His will that will rule and reign. Notice as well, Psalm 16 and verses 8 and 9. I have set the Lord always before me. Because He is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. Now this passage doesn't say, as some people imply, because I have the right hand of strength. That's not what that passage says. Because I have strength, notice what it says here. Because He is at my right hand. You see, here's divine protection. It's not us. Amen. It's not you and I. It's not the physical strength that we might have. But He says, He is at my right hand, I shall not be moved. And He goes on to say, I'm glad in this. And I rejoice in this. And as a matter of fact, He says, my flesh rests in hope. So God's protection is something that must be understood, just like deliverance from bondage, just like salvation, and the points that we have made. If we take it too literally, we lose the effect, and we lose what God is teaching from these particular points. Now, again, right on the heels of that, He is our strength and our shield. He is our support, divine support, point number F. He is our divine support. Psalm 63 says, you have been my help, therefore in the shadow of your wings I will rejoice. You know what that indicates? Just like an old hen would gather up her chicks and she'd put them under them and protect them. And she may sit there through wind and whatever till the danger passed. And that's the image that we see here. I will be at peace under your wings, He says. I'll rejoice because your wings are my protection. Your wings are my protection. I'll sing praise to you as well. I'll greatly rejoice. Now let's back up just a little bit. He uses two words. The Lord is my strength and my shield. If you can understand these two words, you can understand this passage very well. The idea here of strength is power. The Lord is my power. The Lord empowers me. He gives me what I need to have that I must do. Secondly, the idea of a shield here is a protector, as the hen protects her chicks, and so on. So we have divine support. I remember 1 Corinthians 10 and verse 13. We'll be tempted, but we'll be tempted above what we are able to withstand. God protects us. He supports us. He provides for us. Also, there is the blessing of the hope of glory. The more I studied this in preparing for this lesson, I know it's not a selfish glory, and I know it's not a glory based upon what I think. It's a glory that I believe we'll have in heaven, because it says, rejoice in the hope, it's yet to come, of the glory of God. It's something hard to understand. It's something hard to describe, because we've never been eternal. We've never been everlasting. We've never been in a place where there's no death and there's no suffering, or no heartache, no tears that will be shed. So we are again, a spiritual blessing is that, and Paul expresses it this way in Romans 5 and in verse 2. He says that we have the hope of glory. I think without a shadow of a doubt he's talking about heaven. But what a blessing that is. What a wonderful thing for us to entertain here in the idea of what are the blessings of that that the Christian has and can enjoy. And as well, when we study these, we need to think and rethink them so that they are a cause for rejoicing. Now, just a word of caution. Let's say we love the world too much. Then every one of these things we have talked about, we have one more to go. Every one of these things that we have talked about are rendered ineffective when you love the world too much. And the answer is easy. It's because God is not the God of this world. He's the God of heaven. He's a God who protects us. He's a God who protects us spiritually, not necessarily physically. If you're blessed to have a security system, that's good. It could save you a lot of heartache and headache if you could have a security system. But you can have the security and the peace of God by obeying Him. He will take care of us. Now, one other cause for rejoicing, and that is the success of the gospel. Paul and Barnabas had returned from their trip, and they come back to Jerusalem, and they were telling them of what had happened concerning the Gentiles and so on. But also some of the accusers have followed them, saying that they needed to be circumcised and so on. And so they were coming back, and they passed through Phoenicia, Samaria, describing the conversion of the Gentiles. Now, as they came back and delivered this news, what was the cause? What happened there? Well, they were saying, here are people that were Gentiles. They were a people, and just use the language of the New Testament, without a law. They're now accepting Christ. They're accepting the gospel. As a matter of fact, they're becoming Christians just like you and I, and they go through Phoenicia and Samaria and on their way back, and they're telling them of how these things had happened, how this had unfolded, and how that they were now being accepted, or by their conversion unto the truth, they were now just as much a part of the church as the Jews were. Now, I like to know of people who are faithful. I like to know of people who obey the gospel. I like to hear when good, faithful Christians stand up for what's right. I like to know when Christians, good, faithful Christians, are persecuted and they endure. And they endure. But when we look at the success of the gospel, do we rejoice as we ought to? When Paul and Barnabas came back and they told them about these conversions, their joy was great. They joined with the brethren in rejoicing because now the door had been opened, or they had become Christians just like them. So the success of the gospel, and here's is the point that I'd like for us to see in this, is not necessarily, okay, here's Paul and Barnabas. Let's rejoice in them. No. Here was Paul and Barnabas who were messengers. They made these trips, or this trip, and they went into the areas of the Gentiles, and they became Christians. Let's rejoice at that. But that's, you know, the thing about it is, sometimes people get carried away, and because it's not an immediate rejoicing or success of the gospel right here, which we want success in the gospel, then there's no cause for rejoicing. I think we ought to rejoice just like when Paul and Barnabas came back and we hear of a good friend or a neighbor or somebody that we have been acquaintances a long time with, to know that they become a Christian. I think we need to rejoice. Not necessarily because of their name, but because their names are written in heaven. And so, the success of the gospel is something that I think we need to, again, be aware of. And here's what that does. The success of the gospel is not any one person's, reason to brag. It's every one of us. Go into all the world and preach the gospel. It's every one of us that needs to preach and teach the gospel. And what happens then is the rejoicing is not, well, I tell you right now, Iffy is the best I've ever seen. Iffy ought to be a saint of God. Many people he's converted. Iffy, you're a good person, but we can't saint you. But you see, that's heaping praise in the wrong place. It's the gospel. It's the gospel. When they were scattered, what did they carry with them? Oh, they had, some of them took their gold, some of them took their silver. I don't know that. I know they took the gospel. Because they went everywhere as they were scattered, preaching the gospel. Now notice something here in Acts chapter 15, and then we'll pause. In Acts chapter 15, what happens next is so typical of Satan and his works. There were some there of the Pharisees who raised up and caused problems. So the elders there at Jerusalem came together in this meeting, and they considered this question of circumcision. Now that sometimes happens as well, more times than not. When there is growth, when there is success in the gospel, it just seems like evil is just around the corner. It seems like problems are just around the corner. And that's what happened here. Paul and Barnabas came back on a high note, and they should have. We went over here and we preached the gospel, and you know what? They listened to it and they believed it, and they became Christians, and they rejoiced together. But then Satan doesn't give up. He doesn't give up. So, we have many causes to rejoice. Many causes to rejoice. And the list is not exhaustive. I hate to start the next section, but we haven't gone 3 weeks on a lesson, but maybe we need to this time. But perhaps we need to quit here. I know it's a little early, but any comments or questions on this to this point?
Well, Chris, you remember from the unit obeyed the gospel, and when he baptized him, he's been on his way rejoicing. You know, that's something to rejoice about.
Right.
Salvation is one of the greatest things that ever happened for mankind.
Mm-hmm.
God forgives them through Christ.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to tell you something. We need to be praising Him for what He done.
Exactly.
Because I tell you, we're hell-bound if we don't obey the gospel.
Right. Right. I'll tell you something else about the Ethiopian treasure that always amazes me. He was a religious man. I don't know what his religion was. We could probably search it out and find, but he had been to worship. And he come back and he heard the gospel, and he didn't say, well, let's just add this on top of what I already believe. Or do you confirm what I believe? He obeyed the gospel, and I believe that's why he was rejoicing, Delmer. He had quit all of that. He had put that away. Now he's under the law of Christ. And so he wasn't willing to take Christ plus anything, or salvation plus anything. He simply wanted salvation. Here's water. Why can't I be baptized? Perhaps you're here tonight, and you need to make correction in your life, or something has brought you to the point of being separated from God, and we can help you make that correction. Or if you're here tonight and you've never obeyed the gospel, or obeyed the gospel, and you're not satisfied with your completing your obedience, can we not